22, lesson 10. Got down to verse 6. You will remember that David has finally really fled Saul's house and is officially on the run after trying to do that before and then coming back and seeing if things get a little better. He is really and truly on the run and amassing some people who are also disgruntled for various reasons. And we have the beginnings of David's army that he's going to end up seizing control with. But we're still a little ways off from that. Last week we talked about how he went to the city of Nob and got some assistance from the priests there. Today we're going to see some of the consequences of that action, and that the priests of Nob are going to face Saul's wrath. So beginning in verse 6, 1 Samuel 22, verse 6, it says, "Now Saul heard that David was discovered and the men who were with him. Saul was sitting at Gibeah under a tamarisk tree on the height with his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing about him. And Saul said to his servants who stood about him, 'Hear now, people of Benjamin, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? That all of you have conspired against me. No one discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as at this day.' Then answered Doeg the Edomite, who stood by the servants of Saul, 'I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech the son of Ahitub, and he had inquired of the Lord for him, and gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine.'" So I want you to notice a couple of things here. One, that there's a contrast, physically speaking, in what we see the position of Saul and the position of David. David is hiding out in caves and going to foreign countries and having this kind of trouble and finding a secure and safe place to be. Whereas Saul is in the royal city, which is Gibeah right now. He is in this position of power. He's sitting under a tamarisk tree. He's up on a hill. He's surrounded by his whole royal court. He has all of the trappings of kingly power. Yet, who is it that seems more desperate in this? David is, in a bind for sure. He's definitely in a tough spot. But he is amassing people, and he has been kept safe throughout all of this. Saul is surrounded by people who theoretically serve him, yet he is paranoid, and he is angry at his own servants, and he feels his power slipping away. The rant that he goes on here is somewhere between angry and deranged, depending on how exactly you want to read it. But it's not a good look for him. Saul does not have control of the situation. What are your thoughts as you see Saul talking to his court here? Anything jump out at you? Yeah. It seems like, and it's hard to know how much of this is Saul's paranoia and how much of it is actually known and actually true. But it seems like Saul's the last one to know what's going on. He has finally discovered that David and Jonathan have this covenant together. And how do we think that went down? We don't have any real explanation for how that conversation went. But can you even imagine that Saul has discovered that his son has a covenant supporting David and saying, I know that you're going to be the next king? I don't know. There's a lot there that would anger Saul for sure. He is furious. And it seems that other people know that this has happened even before Saul knew. I find that interesting because Saul does seem to know already, even in an earlier stage in the story, he knew that Jonathan and David were close. But there also seems to be this belief on Saul's part that Jonathan wouldn't be so foolish as to throw away his throne, as to completely give up his inheritance and his right to be the next king of Israel. And that was the way that he talked to Jonathan before, of don't side with the son of Jesse, don't side with David, because he will take your throne from you. That is not the path to success and the path to power. You need to view him as an enemy, as I view him as an enemy. And Saul was so furious with Jonathan that Jonathan could not seem to understand that he spoke very, very harshly to him. When Saul had said, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman," that's a kind of glossed over nice version of something very rude that we even say today when we shouldn't be saying it, but some people say that kind of thing to a person when they're angry, of questioning their heritage, we'll put it that way. And this is not a good way for Saul to be speaking to his own son. Yeah, this is how angry he is and how much he hates David. Yeah.
He just doesn't sound like a strong king at all through here. And the only way to be strong is in God, really.
Yeah.
For these people at this time, to be in God. And David is on God's side. Saul is out of the loop of God, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is the point that we are meant to get from these events, that Saul is drifting further and further from God. He's very far from God at this point. And even though he has all the physical trappings of power, and even though he is king of Israel right now, he really has lost a lot of his power, and he's lost a lot of his ability to lead. This is not the same Saul who could rally the entire nation and say, we are going to save that city. We are going to fight against our enemies, and if you won't do it, I'll cut your animals in two and burn your houses down. This is our duty, our responsibility. We need to pull together and fight for the cause of the Lord. Now Saul just sounds deranged, desperate, paranoid, the last to know anything, and completely out of control of the situation. Okay.
Well, he's already been told by Samuel that he's rejected.
Yes.
It seems crazy that he can't accept any of this, and he's fighting against God.
Yeah. We have a tendency to simply not accept things that we would rather not be true. That just mentally we reject it. Mentally we pretend like that was never said, or pretend like that is not reality. And I think that's what Saul is doing. He's been told, he should know. The proper course of action for him at this point would be to be the best king that he can be, and to serve God as faithfully as possible, and to accept the reality that when he dies, this is not going to pass on to his son. And he could do this in a very faithful and peaceful kind of way. Instead, he's pretending like it didn't happen, pretending like he still has control over the situation and can somehow overcome David. But it's not unusual for a king to face challengers, people who would like to usurp the throne from him. But in this case, David is chosen by God. You're not going to succeed over David. You're not going to be able to kill him. You're not going to be able to protect the throne for Jonathan. So, as furious... Oh, yeah, Sue, please go ahead.
One of the things that I found ironic in his little speech here was, can David give you things?
Yeah.
As if Saul could.
Right.
You know, it was David that had defeated Goliath, that led the army,
Right, yeah. Saul would like everyone to believe that he is, all powerful and that he is the one who grants them things. He is the one who keeps them safe and defends them against the Philistines. And it's not even really true. It's increasingly less true as time goes on, because David is the one who has been defending them against the Philistines. David is the one who's getting more of these successes than Saul is. Saul was paralyzed against Goliath. Saul was losing control over multiple situations. It's not just one. It keeps happening to Saul, and David is the one who goes forward and seizes the victory. Even Jonathan is the one who goes forward and seizes the victory. God is with Jonathan too, because Jonathan is with David, because Jonathan is not trying to resist. That this shows us that God has not taken Saul's family and said, I hate everyone in this lineage and I would rather destroy them and crush them. God's perfectly happy to be with Jonathan and to empower Jonathan to succeed, even though he's not going to be the next king. There's a lot more to pleasing God than just being the next king of Israel. And Saul wants to leverage his position when it's dying, when he's not even really going to hold on to it that much longer. Okay?
Well, another thing we see is when David does take over, he does give some places to the Benjamites.
Yeah.
It's not like he excludes them at all.
Right.
He doesn't hold anything against them.
Yeah.
He doesn't hold what Saul's done against the Benjamites.
Yeah, David is remarkably gracious as he transitions into becoming king. He doesn't do what a lot of new kings would do, of cleaning house of anyone who even was remotely connected to the previous king. He does a pretty good job of acting honorably. Mark.
Yeah, it's interesting to see what's happening here since the re-establishment of the covenant between Jonathan and David, where Jonathan basically says, you're going to be king, and I want to serve under you.
Yeah.
So you see this application of what would typically happen, because they see that this is of God. And now David is acting directly against the king that is in place.
Yeah.
He has an army. He doesn't have to have an army.
Right.
He could have told those people, go home. No, we're not doing this. He still acts in accordance with God's will, no matter what. And we see that, we'll see that later. He has complete respect for the guy who's still anointed by God, who God put in place. He just wants God to take care of it. But he has this army with him now. So I'm assuming, is in the mindset that he's going to be king. And he understands this now. And now he's acting like that's what's going to happen.
Yes, and this chapter is going to show the next chapter rather is going to show another incident of David fulfilling some of that role. It's going to remind us of early Saul again, as David kind of is fulfilling that military protector kind of role. Lots happening here. Diane?
It just makes me think, Saul, like when what James says, when you have that desire and it's conceived and it gives birth to sin, and that's his driving force, and that's there's just you can see how powerful our sin that grows in us, and if we don't give ourselves over to Christ, what He desires, then we go with what we desire. Sad.
Yeah, sin has to progress. When we're indulging desires, carnal desires, it always develops into more, and the sin is going to just spread and grow within our lives. We see it happening with Saul here. He started out as a strong and even righteous man who maybe had some weaknesses and had some things he needed to overcome. We saw a few little shades of strange choices at the beginning, or some character flaws at the beginning, but overall very, very good. And the problem is here is that Saul is feeding the wrong part of himself. He's feeding the sinful desires that he has, and those are overtaking everything good that he used to be. And Saul is not some demonic person for going down this path. This is the way it happens. This is what would happen to anyone when you choose to indulge the sinful desires. Sue? No, sorry. Okay, so Saul is kind of losing his grip on the situation, but Doeg the Edomite, you remember that name from last week? Doeg was at Nob when David was there, and looked like he was kind of captured or arrested there for some reason. But somehow that has ended, and he is back there with Saul, and he sees an opportunity. Saul is angry at everybody. Saul thinks that everyone has betrayed him. This is an opportunity for him to ingratiate himself to Saul and say, I have some information. I know where David has been getting some help. And so he says, I saw him coming to Nob, to this priest, Ahimelech, and Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for David, gave him provisions, gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. That is all true. That is something that happened, although we know that it was a little bit more complicated than that, because what had David said when he was there?
It was on the king's orders.
Yeah,
And vision.
right. So Ahimelech did not necessarily do this believing that he was supporting a usurper of the throne or going against Saul. As far as he knows, he is still helping the case, the cause of Saul, and is going to be helping one of his greatest generals and son-in-law. There's a lot of reasons why he would assume that David is still in the good graces of Saul. However, that's not going to help him here, because what we see is Saul, in his rage and in his paranoia, summons Ahimelech and all of those priests, summons Ahimelech just first, from Nob to come before the king. So he's got this audience before the king, and Saul has some things to say. Verse 12, Saul said, Hear now, son of Ahitub. And he answered, Here I am, my lord. And Saul said to him, Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, and that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, so that he has risen against me to lie in wait, as at this day? And Ahimelech's response is, who among all your servants is so faithful as David, who is the king's son-in-law, and captain over your bodyguard, and honored in your house? Is today the first time that I have inquired of God for him? No, let not the king impute anything to his servant or to all the house of my father, for your servant has known nothing of all this, much or little. We have no reason to disbelieve what Ahimelech is saying here, because we know what David told him, because we know there was some deception when David came to Nob. And there's no indication that Ahimelech was doing anything other than what he says here, helping the son-in-law of the king, the general, the celebrated hero of Israel. And as he says, this isn't the first time that I've inquired of God for him. David is a man who follows God. He is a man who has had a relationship with the priests before. That might explain some of how the sword of Goliath ended up there. In the city of Nob, lending some credence to the idea that David was there previously or had met with Ahimelech previously. Ahimelech had inquired of God for him. David had given the sword as a gift or something like that. Now David has that sword back, but Ahimelech is blindsided by all of this and saying, how am I supposed to know that you did not want me to help your son-in-law? This is pretty fair for him to say. But Saul is not going to let this pass and say, okay, well, we all make mistakes. I can see why you might have thought that. No, he says, verse 16, you shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house. And the king turns to the guard who stood about him and said, turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and they knew that he fled and just did not disclose it to me. So Saul has sentenced them to death for treason, for rebellion, and orders the guards to kill the priests. But what do the guards think about this? Aaron?
Well, they have some dignity. They're not willing to turn around and just kill the priests of God
Yeah.
in cold blood.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that Ahimelech, he sees David as David is.
Right.
He sees him as faithful. And those words must have infuriated Saul a little bit. And probably the truth of what Ahimelech was saying, in that David is faithful, he's your son-in-law, and he's, this is, why would you think anything else? But of course, Saul's way beyond that. He doesn't really see David in the same way. But the people that are surrounding this whole situation, it's very clear to them what's happening.
Yeah.
Like, they're looking at the priest, they hear what he's saying, like, that is completely reasonable.
Yes.
And it's the priest of God. No, we're
Yeah.
not gonna do this. And how embarrassing.
Yeah.
For the king.
This is not even the first time that everyone around Saul has gone, are you sure? You're not really acting reasonably right now. Remember his servants, we need to find somebody to help calm Saul down, to, some musician to be able to get him through these moods. Like, the people around Saul know he is unhinged. He is not doing things that are reasonable and normal. This isn't even like, oh, Saul's being particularly strict and that's a hard thing to swallow. Saul's not even being sensible. And the people around him can tell. Steve.
Yeah, Valley, that's, like you said, it's been done. He's lost credibility to the,
Yeah.
you want to get Johnson
Yeah. He doesn't have credibility. And to openly defy the king and to say, no, I'm not going to kill these priests, you've got to feel pretty strongly about that. They really believed in the authority of the king and that being an all-encompassing sort of authority, yet none of these guards are interested in stepping forward to be able to kill the priests of God.
Yeah, but it doesn't seem like, they didn't want to kill the priest, but it doesn't seem like they was defending the priest either.
No, they're not.
It's like they just took like a neutral stand.
Yeah,
We're
and
going to kill them, but we're not going to defend them either.
yeah. There's the paralysis of fear of knowing that Saul is acting in this very unhinged way. And yes, better would have been to defend the priests and say, Saul, this is not reasonable. Saul, this is, you should not kill these men of God in cold blood when they have done nothing to deserve it. That would have been even better. They don't go that far. But they also don't go far as to obey what Saul has said here. Really, you get the image that Saul has just corrupted and tainted everything around him. That there's a lot of evil happening in Saul's court, but even this just goes too far for the people in Saul's court. People seem to realize that Saul is out of control, out of hand. There is some evidence that leads us to believe that this kind of practice was common in those days, in that part of the world, that the kings expected that the priests would have complete and total loyalty to them. And even though, even if you're talking about pagan priests and these other nations, that the priests would have a connection to the gods and would be able to advise the king on what to do with, the supernatural and how to call upon the gods and all of that. But that they were obligated to support the king in everything. They were not permitted to support anyone else. And I mention that because that is a somewhat new discovery that we have had, that this kind of response of killing all the priests, we have evidence that some things like that happened in the nations around Israel in similar situations where it was perceived or really did happen that the priests were supporting another contender to the throne, another person who wanted to be in control. So Saul may very well be acting like the other kings around him, but that's not necessarily a compliment, right? The people have asked for a king who would be, help them be like all the nations around them, and they've gotten it. But Saul has done so much damage to Israel and so much damage to the spiritual health of God's people. Gary.
It shows us the reality also that completely innocent people are killed sometimes.
Yeah.
And it makes you think, of course, of Jesus.
Yep.
And Christians that were persecuted to death.
Yep.
It's just a reality that it's that way.
Yeah. Absolutely. Innocent people are killed. Innocent people are the victims of sinners and the victims of evil people all the time. It happens, and God does not always stop it from happening. God is a vengeful God in the end, in that he will make all things right. Right now, he is trying to be patient with all of us to get us to come closer to him and to be forgiven. Saul, even now, still has opportunity to be forgiven, still has opportunity to be right with God, even if he's going to lose the throne. But he's getting further and further away from any position where he could make that sort of decision. Okay?
Well, he is fulfilling prophecy.
Mhm.
This was prophesied that Eli's heritage would disappear.
Right.
So this almost takes care of that prophecy
Yeah.
right here.
It does. And this is one example of how God can use even the actions, the sinful actions of sinful people to accomplish certain things that God sees fit to accomplish. He's not going to protect the priests here, because this is part of a judgment against the line of Eli. Not but that these particular priests have guilt in this situation. They do not. These particular priests are innocent, but they're also having to deal with the consequences of having an evil king and the consequences of sins in generations past that have ripple effects that have extended to their day. We deal with similar things. The sinful actions of other people affect us all the time, whether that's people in our past, in our ancestors, previous generations. The ripple effects of their sins are bringing us different kinds of pain, or the people in the community and the nation and the world around us who do not always make good decisions, and those sinful decisions end up hurting us. And God doesn't always shield us from that. How it happens here, right? Doeg is the only one who is willing to put a hand against the priests of the Lord, which should not be surprising because he is an Edomite who cares nothing about the Lord. Again, I want you to see who Saul is allying with. that Saul finds a willing servant and somebody who can carry out his will, but he's got to get an Edomite to do it. He's got to get somebody who has no connection to God in order to carry out what he wants. Does that say good things about Saul? That he is most effective when he is bringing pagans in to carry out his will? I think we see that Saul's purposes are getting farther and farther away from God's purposes. So Doeg struck down the priests, killed 85 people that day, and goes on to the city of Nob. Doesn't just kill Ahimelech and his family, doesn't just kill the priests, kills really the whole city. Verse 19 says, both man and woman, child and infant, ox, donkey, and sheep he put to the sword. This is a violent and evil overflow of sin, where Doeg is just going to go on a murderous rampage. And he's been ordered by Saul to do so, although he almost seems like he is going a little farther than what Saul said, but that does not justify any of these actions. So one of Ahimelech's sons, one of Ahimelech's sons, Abiathar, escapes Nob, and he fled after David. And he tells David everything that has happened. And what is David's response to this news? Aaron.
The one who seeks your life seeks mine, and I'll keep you safe. He also kind of, takes responsibility,
Yeah.
for that. And, when he saw Doeg there, he's like, I knew that
Yeah.
this was going to get passed on to Saul. I don't think David knew what Saul's reaction was going to
Sure.
be. But he knew that it wasn't, like, his secret wasn't going to last very long.
Yeah. That happens a lot of times to us, right? We're in, like, we feel like we're backed into a corner. We have to do something kind of desperate, or kind of maybe telling the truth isn't an option here, so we think. So we need to be deceitful, and we have this idea of the way that this could backfire. And I can imagine David seeing Doeg and going, "This is going to get back to Saul eventually." It doesn't stop him from making that decision in the moment, but David does seem to regret it here, and he takes responsibility for it. And that was why I mentioned last week that we shouldn't necessarily feel the urge to justify every one of David's actions as he is fleeing Saul. Some of David's decisions aren't good, and some of them should have been handled better. Even in that desperation, David could have made different choices, and David seems to recognize that here. He takes responsibility, seems to regret it, and his only way of trying to make up for it, and something that is very true here, is to remind Abiathar, your enemies are my enemies, so stay with me, and I'll protect you. Stay with me, and I'll make sure that I keep you safe. So David's making the best he can of the situation, but I think has learned something here, that there were consequences to those actions, and he's going to need to be very careful about the way that he conducts himself going forward. Lito.
Yeah, I see a foreshadowing of the coming of Christ and King, starting from Ahimelech's testimony to the king, that about David, which tells me that the plan of God is in here. Can you imagine the king's order of murdering, slaughtering all the lineage of Ahimelech? There is still one that's king, which continues the plan of God.
Yeah, that is a lot like what Herod did in trying to resist the plan of God and resisting this good thing that God is bringing about. But God does not allow that to be successful in killing his plan. God's plan is going to continue. Okay, chapter 23. We have a few interesting things that happen here. One being that David hears about the Philistines attacking a city, the city of Keilah. And they're robbing the threshing floors, they're raiding and oppressing as the Philistines tended to do. The Philistines usually didn't come in to conquer a place and to take the city for themselves. That kind of thing happened sometimes. But more often they were fairly happy with their cities and just came to take their stuff, to take their food, to take their possessions and their treasures. It gave them more that would enrich their own lives. And so that's what they're doing here with Keilah. And David inquires of the Lord and says, "Shall I go and attack these Philistines?" That is a very interesting question from David. Why might that be interesting? Mark?
I don't know, but I would think that this is an action that the king should be making.
Yeah.
And again, to me, it kind of points to his mindset that he's thinking, I need to protect the country, and that's what a king would do. I'm not the king, but I do have his army, so he's
Right.
making these movements toward that.
Yeah. Is that not like one of Saul's major purposes here, Aaron?
Well, it's just a good indication of a leader.
Yeah.
You know, leaders don't need to be in a position of leadership necessarily to do the right thing. So David is just looking at something that needs to be done and saying, is this something that I should do?
Yeah.
And goes to the Lord and
Yeah.
inquires, which, again, just the contrast between David and Saul is so striking
Yeah.
in that he's not the king and he's doing all the kingly things.
Yep.
He's going to God, he's taking action. And leadership is a decision.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a position. And that, David makes that very, very evident.
Yes. And keep picking up on all those differences, those contrasts that are showing up between Saul and David. That's the idea that the writer is trying to get across to us. Who's acting more like a king right now? Who is fulfilling God's purposes? Who is God with? Saul was named king to keep them safe from the Philistines. That was the thing Israel was most concerned with. God had other purposes for Saul, but as far as Israel was concerned, that was the big one. Where is he? Where is Saul? Why is this kind of raid happening if Saul is going to be the imposing figure who can defend them from all their enemies? David is willing to do what Saul is not. Mark?
Yeah, the phrase that I found really important is where it says, the Lord said to David. So God is speaking directly to David. And that it's all leading towards what's going to happen. We don't know.
Yeah.
God is speaking to David. That is a big deal in my mind.
Yes. And you can take that two different ways, and it's hard to know, or maybe even both. But one thing that has changed now is David has this priest who's going along with him. And so it's possible that God is speaking to David through this priest. David before was going to inquire of God through Ahimelech. He had to go to Ahimelech to make this happen. Now Abiathar is with him, and so maybe Abiathar is doing that. But the emphasis here isn't put on Abiathar, even if God is doing it through that priest, which is possible, maybe even probable. The emphasis that's given here is it's God who's with David. It's God who is speaking to David and guiding David. This is a pretty important development and a strong contrast with what's happening with Saul. Jeff?
Yeah, we see, like when Jonathan
you know, Jonathan said, well, if God's gonna be with us, this is gonna happen, you
Yeah.
know, stuff. We don't know that David didn't, I mean, it says here that David inquired of God.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't know that wasn't a practice of David all the time, whenever he
Yeah.
went into battle. He might have inquired of God, should I go up here? Should I go up here?
Yeah.
You know, every time.
I think it's a fair,
Like
yeah.
Gideon and stuff like that, you know.
Yeah.
You know, should I do this? Okay, I'm going.
Yeah. I think it's a fairly safe assumption. We see out of David somebody who does make a habit of inquiring of God. It maybe is not mentioned directly in every instance, but he shows the pattern of a man who wants to know what God wants him to do, and then goes and does it even when it is hard. Leader.
I see, I think Steve has his hand.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Steve? Mhm.
I just, it's kind of an overview, because it still comes up. At what point were the Philistines granted ownership of any of the land anywhere?
I don't know when they first got into that land. They've been there a long time, for sure. But they're just kind of a thorn in Israel's side. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, leader?
Yeah, see, I just want to say that the reliance of David on God
Mm-hmm.
is really portrayed in here. The self-discipline and self-control, knowing that the confusion of Saul, because from the time that between the covenant that he made with Jonathan, saying, how in the world why your father must have killed me, I haven't done anything. But
Yeah.
still, knowing this, he found himself in humility and humbleness that
Yeah.
because he knows that Saul was chosen by God and he honors that.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Aaron?
Remember that all the time. But
Yeah.
he knows also that he needs to continue relying on God and continue the plan.
Yeah. Definitely. Aaron?
It's also interesting the difference between kind of David's faith and the people around him.
Yeah.
And he inquires of the Lord, and the Lord says, go. That was enough for David.
Yep.
He went and told his men, all right, we're going. And they said, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Like, we're barely getting by here in our own land.
Yeah.
You know, how much more difficult is this going to be going into foreign territory?
Yeah.
So he inquires of the Lord again,
Yeah.
and then God gives him a little more,
Mhm.
you know, yeah, I'm going to act and I'm going to give you victory.
Yeah. Yeah, and remember, David's men, most of them are, disgruntled people who want a regime change because their lives have fallen apart in various ways. They are not thrilled about the prospect of being both the enemy of Saul and the enemy of the Philistines. Typically, if you're going to go against the current leadership, you say the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? Well, the enemy of my enemy is also my enemy just kind of means that you are enemies with everybody at this point. And this is not savvy from the perspective of somebody who wants to stay alive and to find success in their rebellion. But David has a different goal in mind. This isn't rebellion because David hates Saul so much. This is David being interested in fulfilling the purposes of God, and God still has the purpose of defending Israel and of being able to protect against the Philistines. So David's going to fulfill this role. Jeff?
Well, David really didn't see Saul as his enemy. Saul
Yeah.
considered David his enemy.
Right.
David had nothing against Saul.
Yeah.
So, Saul's enemies, the enemies of Israel were still David's enemies. It wasn't, that
Yes.
David had, Saul's an enemy and the other.
Right.
No, he was faithful to the king, because he had opportunities to kill him, and he wasn't going to put his hand toward Saul.
Yes, I definitely agree. That was David's mindset. I don't think that was the mindset of every person in David's army, because a lot of them were there for less noble reasons than David had. David's going to teach them something here. He's going to lead by example and say, this is what we're going to do. This is the kind of life that we live and the purpose that we have. We're not here as instruments of chaos. We're here as tools in the hands of God. And so the Philistines are still the enemy. But yes, very important distinction. This is not your typical usurper to the throne or somebody staging a coup. This is David really trying to stay out of Saul's way and not wanting to attack Saul. And God being the one that kind of puts David into position to take over. There will be some more hostilities as time goes on, but David is acting in some unusual ways. Just very briefly here, we see David and his men go up to Keilah. They fought against the Philistines. They're very successful, save the inhabitants of Keilah. And then then Saul hears of it. Saul was not willing to go and to save Keilah, but he sure is willing to send troops out there to get David. And so he's going to lay siege to Keilah, to his own city, right? And David inquires of the Lord again, are these people going to give me up to Saul, or are they going to be on my side? God tells him they'll give you up to Saul, so David flees again. Interesting, but the people of Keilah would not protect their deliverer, but that's what God tells him. And then we see just I just want to hit this real quick, two important things that happen. One, David and Jonathan meet up for the very last time. They don't know it's the last time, but they see each other again. They renew their covenant once more, and they're able to have this moment where they kind of make the same sort of promises to each other. And David promises to help Jonathan and his family, and Jonathan promises to support him, though in reality they're never going to see each other again. David will make good on that promise with Jonathan's descendants, but not so much with Jonathan himself. And David is just forced further and further away. Saul continues chasing after David. David's heading south. At one point in time, they're on opposite sides of the same mountain, going around on opposite sides. It's a very tense moment. But Saul has to give up chasing David because the Philistines are attacking again. And God kind of pulls Saul away with this threat with the Philistines so that he will not catch David. And all this, Saul is relying on kind of these rumors and desperation, just hearing what David is doing and where he is, and trying to catch up with him, whereas David is led directly by God. Okay, sorry for rushing through the last little bit, but next week I want to go ahead and move on to the next lesson. Unless you have some particular question or point you really want to bring up on this, hold on to it, write it down, and start us off next week with it. Thank you.